Madison sat quietly at her small stand in Goodale Park, her paintings carefully arranged on the table. Each brushstroke told a story of hope, of resilience, of a young girl refusing to give in to the battle she was fighting. At just 12 years old, she was facing leukemia, and the hospital bills were overwhelming. Every weekend, she sat there, hoping that someone would notice her art, that maybe a few paintings would sell to help cover the costs. People stopped, some offering encouraging words, others purchasing a piece. But on this particular afternoon, something extraordinary was about to happen. A black SUV pulled up nearby. The door opened, and a man stepped out, taking a leisurely stroll through the park. Madison didn't recognize him at first, but others did. It was Vice President J.D. Vance. As he walked past, his eyes landed on her stand. He paused, drawn to one painting in particular, a phoenix, its fiery wings spreading wide, rising from the ashes. He stepped closer, picking up the canvas, studying it. "Did you paint this?" he asked, his voice kind but curious. Madison nodded. "Yeah, it's about starting over. No matter what." Something in her words struck him. He reached for his wallet, but then he hesitated. Instead, he knelt to her level and asked, "How much for all of them?" Her mother, sitting nearby, gasped. Madison's eyes widened. "All of them?" she repeated in disbelief. He nodded. "Every single one." She stammered, unsure what to say. I was hoping to sell them to help pay for my chemo." Vance smiled. "Then consider it done." He handed over an envelope. Far more than what the paintings were worth. But he wasn't finished yet. By the next morning, news of his gesture had spread. Madison's story went viral, reaching thousands, then millions. Donations poured in from strangers who had never met her, but felt compelled to help. Within days, her medical expenses were covered. But the impact didn't stop there. Inspired by her courage, an art foundation was set up in her name to help other children battling illnesses. Her simple act of selling paintings in the park turned into a movement, proving that one moment of kindness could change not just one life, but many. Madison could hardly believe what was happening. One day, she was sitting in the park, hoping to sell a few paintings, and the next, her story was spreading like wildfire. News stations picked it up, social media flooded with shares, and people from around the world sent messages of encouragement. As donations poured in, her mother, overwhelmed with emotion, realized something incredible. Madison's medical bills would no longer be a worry. But Madison wasn't thinking just about herself. Sitting in her hospital bed, recovering from a round of treatment, she turned to her mother with an idea. "We have enough now, right?" she asked softly. Her mother nodded, wiping away tears. "More than enough, sweetheart." Madison's lips curled into a small smile. "Then I want to help other kids, too." With the support of J.D. Vance and many others, a foundation was launched in Madison's name, dedicated to helping children with serious illnesses afford their treatments. But it wasn't just about money. Inspired by Madison's love for art, the foundation also provided painting supplies and creative workshops for kids in hospitals, giving them a way to express themselves and find hope through creativity. Madison became a symbol of resilience, her phoenix painting a representation of not just her own journey, but of every child fighting for a second chance. She was invited to events, met artists who wanted to collaborate, and even had her work displayed in galleries. One of her paintings, the same phoenix that had caught J.D. Vance's attention, was auctioned for a record-breaking amount, with all proceeds going to help others. Through it all, Madison remained the same determined girl who had once sat in the park, hoping for just a little bit of help. But now, she was the one offering hope to so many others. And as she stood on stage at a charity gala months later, looking out at a sea of people who had come together because of her story, she realized something. The Phoenix wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had faced darkness and still found a way to rise. As Madison stood on stage at the charity gala, she felt the weight of everything that had happened. The struggle, the kindness of strangers, and the overwhelming support that had transformed her life. The room was silent, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath, clutching the microphone tightly. "I started painting because it made me feel free," she began. "When I was sick, it was the one thing that made me forget about hospitals and medicine. I never thought my paintings would lead to something like this." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some were wiping away tears, others smiled, moved by her courage. "But what I learned," she continued, "is that hope is like art. It starts as just a small idea, a brushstroke. But when people come together, when they believe in something, it becomes bigger than just one person. That's what all of you have done, not just for me, but for so many kids who need help." The audience erupted in applause. Among them was J.D. Vance, who watched with pride as the girl whose artwork had first caught his eye now stood as an inspiration to millions. After the gala, Madison's foundation continued to grow. Hospitals across the country partnered with her to bring art therapy to young patients. Her story reached global organizations, sparking new initiatives to support children battling critical illnesses. Despite her newfound recognition, Madison remained humble. She still painted whenever she could, often gifting her artwork to children in hospitals. And every weekend, when she was strong enough, she returned to Goodale Park, not to sell her paintings, but to teach other kids how to paint, just as she once had. One day, as she packed up after a painting session in the park, a little girl with a bald head and bright eyes tugged on her sleeve. "Madison," the girl said softly, "do you think I could paint a phoenix too?" Madison knelt beside her and smiled. "Of course! And you know what? Your phoenix will be just as strong as you are." As they sat together, dipping brushes into vibrant colors, Madison realized something. She had once painted a phoenix to express her own fight, but now she was helping others paint their own, each one a story of hope, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to give up. And that, she knew, was the greatest masterpiece of all. As time went on, Madison's impact only grew. What started as a small act of selling paintings in the park had transformed into a movement. Her foundation, Phoenix Rising, became a beacon of hope for children battling illnesses, offering financial support, art therapy, and encouragement to families in need. Madison herself became a symbol of resilience. She was invited to speak at events, featured in magazines, and even met the president. But through it all, she remained the same girl who simply loved to paint. One day, while visiting a hospital that had partnered with her foundation, Madison walked into a room where a young boy, no older than 6, sat staring at a blank canvas. His mother explained that he had stopped talking ever since his diagnosis. Madison sat beside him, picking up a brush. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said gently. "But maybe you can show me how you're feeling with colors." Chattufi. Boy hesitated before dipping his brush into bright orange paint. Slowly, he dragged it across the canvas. Madison smiled and joined him, adding strokes of red and gold. After a few minutes, he pointed at her brush. "Like this?" he whispered. Madison's heart swelled. It was only 2 words, but they meant everything. "Exactly like that," she said, beaming. Over time, stories like this multiplied. Children who had felt lost found a way to express themselves through art. Families who had once faced impossible medical bills found relief through the foundation. Madison's story had sparked something far greater than she ever imagined. Years passed, and Madison grew into a young woman. Her health remained a battle, but she faced it with the same strength that had carried her through as a child. On her 18th birthday, she held a special event, an art exhibition featuring paintings from kids helped by her foundation. As she walked through the gallery, she saw dozens of phoenixes in all shapes and colors, some bold and fiery, others soft and gentle. Each one told a story of a child who refused to give up. J.D. Vance attended that night, just as he had so many milestones before. He stood beside Madison, looking at the artwork that had all stemmed from one moment years ago. "You changed the world, you know that?" he said. Madison smiled, her eyes reflecting the light of the paintings around her. "No," she said softly. "We all did." And as she looked around at the families, the children, the supporters who had made this journey possible, she realized something profound. Her phoenix had truly risen, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever needed a reason to hope. As the years passed, Phoenix Rising became a global force for change. Madison, now a young woman, continued to paint, advocate, and inspire. Her own health battles had their ups and downs, but she never let them stop her. Every time she faced a setback, she reminded herself of the phoenix, always rising, always fighting. One evening, after a long day of visiting children in a hospital art program, Madison sat alone in her studio. The walls were lined with paintings, some her own, some gifted by children whose lives had been changed through her foundation. She picked up a blank canvas and stared at it for a long time, reflecting on how far she had come. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her mother stepped inside, holding a letter. "This came for you today," she said, handing it over. Madison opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the words. As she read, her breath caught in her throat. It was from the National Endowment for the Arts. They wanted to honor her with a Lifetime Achievement Award for her contributions to art therapy and philanthropy. Tears welled in her eyes as she handed the letter to her mother, who hugged her tightly. The award ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., with dignitaries, artists, and leaders from around the world in attendance. Madison, now 25, walked onto the grand stage, her heart pounding. The audience stood, applauding, but all she could think about was the little girl she once was, sitting in a park, selling paintings to survive. As she reached the podium, she took a deep breath. "When I was 12, I painted a phoenix because I needed hope," she said. "I never imagined that one painting would lead to all of this, but I've learned that hope is contagious. When you share it, it spreads, and together, we've created something bigger than I ever dreamed." The audience erupted in applause, but Madison wasn't finished. She smiled, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "This award isn't just for me. It's for every child who has ever felt lost, for every family who has struggled, for everyone who has faced darkness and found the strength to rise again." J.D. Vance, now a former vice president, stood in the front row, watching with pride. He had once been the spark that ignited this journey, but it was Madison's unbreakable spirit that had carried it forward. As Madison stepped off the stage, a group of children rushed up to her, young artists, cancer survivors, dreamers, just like she had once been. They hugged her, thanked her, and showed her their own paintings, many of them featuring phoenixes, each one unique, each one a symbol of resilience. That night, as Madison looked up at the stars, she knew her journey was far from over. There were more children to help, more stories to tell, more lives to change. And as long as she had a brush in her hand, she would keep painting hope, one stroke at a time. Years passed, and Madison's journey continued to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. Phoenix Rising expanded beyond the United States, reaching hospitals and communities worldwide. Children in countries she had never visited were painting their own phoenixes, inspired by her story. At 30, Madison published her memoir, Rising from the Ashes, detailing her battle with leukemia, the moment J.D. Vance changed her life, and the global movement that followed. The book became a bestseller, touching millions. People who had never picked up a paintbrush before began creating their own artwork, realizing that expression could be just as healing as medicine. But Madison's journey had never been easy. Though her leukemia had gone into remission in her late teens, it returned when she was 32. This time, the treatments were harder, the battle more exhausting. Yet, even as she faced the fight once more, she continued painting, continued advocating, continued believing in the power of hope. One evening, while resting in her hospital bed, she received a special visitor, J.D. Vance himself, now an elder statesman, but still the man who had once bought every painting from a little girl in Goodale Park. He sat beside her, holding one of her old paintings, a small version of the original Phoenix. "You know," he said with a soft smile, "when I first saw this, I thought I was just buying a painting. Turns out, I was part of something much bigger." Madison chuckled weakly but brightly. "You were the first person to believe in me. That changed everything." Vance shook his head. "No, Madison. You changed everything." Their conversation drifted between memories and laughter, and before he left, he placed something in her hands, a framed letter. As she opened it, her eyes widened. It was from the President of the United States. The letter announced that Madison would be receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her contributions to the arts, philanthropy, and childhood cancer awareness. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not because of the honor itself, but because it meant that her story had truly mattered, that the little girl selling paintings in the park had created something that would last long after her. Months later, despite her ongoing treatment, Madison stood on the grand stage at the White House, the world watching as the president placed the medal around her neck. The audience stood in awe, applauding not just her achievements, but her unwavering spirit. She spoke with the same heartfelt sincerity she always had. "I once thought my story was just about me," she said. "But I know now that it belongs to all of us. Because every time a child picks up a paintbrush, every time someone chooses kindness, every time we rise after falling, we prove that hope is stronger than anything." That night, as she sat quietly in her art studio, she started a new painting. Ilitodiodi was another phoenix, but this time it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were countless other phoenixes, each rising, each carrying a story of survival, resilience, and love. And with every brushstroke, Madison knew her legacy would live on. As the years passed, Madison's legacy only grew. Though her health remained fragile, she continued to dedicate herself to Phoenix Rising, ensuring that no child battling illness felt alone. The foundation expanded its reach, opening creative therapy centers in hospitals worldwide, funding medical treatments, and providing scholarships for young artists who had overcome adversity. Madison, now in her late 30s, was invited to speak at the United Nations, where she addressed world leaders about the importance of art in healing. As she stood before them, she held up a small painting, a simple phoenix, much like the one she had painted as a child. "This isn't just a symbol," she said. "This is a promise that no matter how dark the world may seem, there is always a way to rise again. Hope isn't just something we wish for. It's something we create, something we share, something that can change lives." The room erupted in applause, but Madison's focus was never on the praise. It was always on the children she had vowed to help. Despite her own battles, she remained dedicated to her cause. Even on days when her strength was fading, she would sit in hospital rooms, painting with children, reminding them that they were more than their illness. But time was catching up with her. At 42, Madison faced the toughest fight of her life. The leukemia had returned aggressively, and this time the doctors had few options left. Yet, even as she lay in a hospital bed, her spirit remained unbroken. One evening, as she rested, she received a video message from thousands of children around the world, kids whose lives she had touched, holding up their own phoenix paintings. Some had battled cancer and won. Others were still fighting. But each child held up their artwork with pride, showing Madison that her dream had become something far greater than she had ever imagined. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "We did it." Surrounded by family, friends, and those who had supported her throughout her journey, Madison spent her final days exactly as she had always lived, creating, inspiring, and loving with her whole heart. And when she finally took her last breath, the world did not mourn her loss. Instead, it celebrated her life. At her memorial, thousands gathered, not just to say goodbye, but to honor the movement she had built. J.D. Vance, now retired from politics, but forever changed by their chance meeting in the park, stood before the crowd. "Madison didn't just survive, she lived," he said. "She turned her pain into purpose. And because of her, thousands, millions of children will have a chance to rise, just as she did." In honor of her legacy, Phoenix Rising launched the Madison Taylor Art Institute, a place where children could heal through creativity, just as she once had. And in Goodale Park, where it all began, a statue was unveiled, a bronze phoenix, wings spread wide, rising toward the sky. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Hope is not just a dream. It is a masterpiece we create together." Though Madison was gone, her story was far from over. Every child who picked up a brush, every person who chose kindness, every act of resilience carried her spirit forward. And so, the phoenix kept rising.